The polished surface of the mahogany table was a dark, unforgiving mirror. It reflected the strained faces of the family gathered around it, distorting their features into grotesque masks of forced civility. For Arthur, the table felt less like a piece of furniture and more like a battlefield, the clinking of silverware on porcelain sounding like the distant, rhythmic clash of swords. He sat at the head of the table, a position of honor he had not asked for and did not feel he deserved, especially not in this house. This house, with its cathedral ceilings and sterile, designer-chosen decor, felt as alien to him as a lunar landscape. He was a man of simple tastes, of worn-out armchairs and the smell of old books, and this opulent mausoleum of modern wealth made his bones ache with a sense of profound dislocation. His daughter-in-law, Chloe, sat to his right, a queen upon her throne of upholstered leather. Her diamonds caught the light of the ostentatious chandelier above, scattering fractured rainbows across the room, each one a tiny, sharp reminder of the chasm that lay between them. She hadn't looked at him directly all evening, preferring to speak at him, around him, through him, as if he were a ghost at the feast. Her voice, sharp and brittle, cut through the low murmur of conversation. "Another glass of wine, David?" she asked her husband, Arthur's son, her tone less a question and more a command. David, a man perpetually caught in the crossfire between the woman he loved and the father he respected, flinched almost imperceptibly. He mumbled a quiet assent, his eyes flicking nervously toward Arthur. He knew what was coming. He could feel the pressure in the room building, a static charge before a lightning strike. Arthur simply moved a pea around his plate with his fork. He had learned long ago that silence was his only shield in this house. To speak was to offer a target. To explain was to invite ridicule. He had watched his son, David, transform from a boy who loved building model airplanes in their dusty garage into a man who measured his life in stock options and quarterly reports. He didn't blame him. The world had changed and David had changed with it. But in his heart, a quiet sorrow bloomed, a grief for the simple connection they had once shared. Chloe took a delicate sip of her wine, her pinky finger extended in a caricature of elegance. Her eyes, cold and calculating, finally settled on Arthur. It was a look he had seen many times before, a look that stripped him down, assessed him and found him wanting. To her, he was a relic, a dusty, useless antique cluttering up her perfectly curated life. He was a financial drain, a social embarrassment, a living, breathing testament to a past she was desperate to erase. "You know, Arthur," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "we were just talking with the Hendersons the other day about their trip to Aspen." Arthur did not respond. He kept his gaze fixed on his plate, on the single, insignificant pea. He could feel his son's anxiety radiating across the table. He could feel his granddaughter, Lily, shrink into her chair opposite him, her young face a portrait of discomfort. "They were saying how important it is to stay active," Chloe continued, her voice rising slightly, gathering momentum. "To have a purpose. It's so easy at a certain age to just give up." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Arthur's fork stilled. He felt a familiar, weary ache settle deep in his chest. It was the ache of being misunderstood, of being judged by a set of values he had long ago discarded as hollow. He had purpose. His purpose was simply quiet. It was in the morning light that streamed through his small apartment window, in the pages of a well-read book, in the solitary walks he took through the park, where he would watch the world go by with a sense of detached wonder. His purpose was to live honorably, to bother no one, and to carry the memory of his late wife, Eleanor, with a gentle and unwavering devotion. But these were not purposes Chloe could understand. They couldn't be quantified, monetized, or posted on social media. Therefore, they did not exist. He was just an old man, sitting in her expensive house, eating her expensive food, breathing her expensive air. A dead weight, a leech. To Chloe, he was a failure, a ghost from a past of struggle and mediocrity that she and David had triumphantly escaped. But what she didn't know, what no one in this room knew, was that the quiet, unassuming old man at the head of her table was a ghost of a very different kind. He was the ghost of a self-made man, a titan of industry who had built an empire from nothing and then walked away from it all without a backward glance. He was a secret king living as a pauper, not out of necessity, but out of choice. And as Chloe prepared to deliver her final, cruelest blow, she had no idea that she was about to shatter not only her own carefully constructed reality, but the very foundations of the life she held so dear. Welcome to a story that will challenge everything you think you know about wealth, success, and the true measure of a person's worth. We invite you to sit with us, to witness this powerful drama unfold, and to ask yourself some difficult questions. So get comfortable, open your heart, and prepare for a tale of quiet dignity and shocking revelations. What you are about to see will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The journey begins now. Arthur's world was a small, self-contained universe of quiet routine and deliberate simplicity. His apartment, a modest one-bedroom on the third floor of a clean but unremarkable brick building, was his sanctuary. It was a space that bore the imprint of his soul, a stark contrast to the cavernous, impersonal house his son called home. Here, everything had a story, a purpose, a history. The armchair in the corner, its floral pattern faded and its cushions permanently indented with the shape of his body, had been the first piece of furniture he and Eleanor had bought together as a married couple. He could still remember the thrill of it, the shared dream of a life they were building, a dream that felt more real and tangible in that chair than in any bank statement. The walls were lined not with expensive art, but with bookshelves he had built with his own hands, each one groaning under the weight of paperbacks and hardcovers, their spines cracked and their pages soft from countless readings. He had traveled the world through those books, fought dragons, solved mysteries, and debated philosophy with the greatest minds in history, all from the comfort of that worn armchair. His mornings began not with the frantic chime of a smartphone, but with the gentle, rhythmic drip of his old percolator. He would stand by the window, sipping his black coffee, and watch the city slowly wake up. He knew the patterns of his neighborhood by heart. The young mother jogging with a stroller at precisely 6:15 a.m., the old man from downstairs walking his terrier at 6:30, the school bus that rumbled past at 7:45. This was his community, a silent, unspoken fellowship of shared routines. His days were filled with simple tasks that gave him a sense of accomplishment. He tended to the small collection of plants on his windowsill, coaxing life from soil and water. He mended his own clothes, his fingers, though stiff with age, still nimble enough to guide a needle and thread with practiced ease. He would take long, meandering walks without a destination, his only goal to observe, to be present in the moment. He saw beauty where others saw only the mundane. The intricate pattern of a spider's web glistening with dew, the resilience of a wildflower pushing its way through a crack in the pavement, the kindness in the eyes of a stranger who held a door open for him. This life was a conscious choice. It was a fortress he had built against the noise and chaos of the modern world, a world he had once conquered and then willingly abandoned. There were subtle clues to his former life, hidden in plain sight for anyone who cared to look. On his wrist, he wore a simple, steel-cased watch from the 1970s. It was not a luxury brand, not a Rolex or a Patek Philippe. It was a Sima, a brand known for its robust, reliable workhorse movements. But this particular watch was a prototype, one of only 3 ever made, a gift from a Swiss inventor whose company Arthur had saved from bankruptcy with a single, shrewd investment in the early days of quartz technology. In a small, locked wooden box on his dresser, nestled amongst old photographs and love letters from Eleanor, lay a single heavy challenge coin. It wasn't military. On one side was the embossed logo of a company long since absorbed by a multinational conglomerate, Sterling Automations. On the other, a simple inscription, to AV, the man who saw the future, from the grateful few. He never looked at it. He didn't need to. The past was not a place he wished to revisit. He had built Sterling Automations from the ground up, starting in a dusty 2-car garage with a set of borrowed tools and an idea that everyone told him was impossible. He had worked 18-hour days, fueled by black coffee and an unshakable belief in his vision. He had poured his life, his sweat, and all of his and Eleanor's meager savings into that company. He had faced down creditors, outmaneuvered competitors, and innovated his way to the top of a ruthless industry. He had created hundreds of jobs, secured the futures of countless families, and changed the face of manufacturing in the process. And then, at the pinnacle of his success, when the world was his for the taking, he had sold it. He had taken the fortune he had earned, a sum so vast it was almost abstract, and entrusted it to a man he trusted more than anyone, his old friend and lawyer, James Harrison. He had set up a complex web of trusts and investments, ensuring his family would be cared for in perpetuity, and then he had simply walked away. He had kept enough to live on, to be comfortable, but he had shed the rest like a heavy coat he was tired of wearing. The money had been a means to an end, a tool to build a dream. But the dream was built, and the tool was no longer needed. He wanted to go back to the beginning, to the simple things that had brought him joy before the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. He wanted to read his books, tend his plants, and honor the memory of the woman who had been his partner in it all. He had tried to explain it to David once, years ago. He had tried to articulate the crushing burden of that level of wealth, the way it isolated you, the way it turned relationships into transactions, the way it made you question everyone's motives. David, young and ambitious, had not understood. He had seen his father's choice not as an act of liberation, but as an act of abdication. And so Arthur had stopped trying to explain. He had allowed his son and his son's wife to believe what they wanted to believe, that he was a simple man who had led a simple life, a man who had peaked early with a small, modestly successful business and was now living out his twilight years on a meager pension. He let them believe he was poor, because it was easier than explaining the complex truth of why he chose to live as if he were. His wealth was a secret he guarded not out of shame, but out of a profound and deeply felt sense of peace. It was a secret that allowed him to be seen for who he was, not for what he had. But sitting at that polished mahogany table, under the cold, judgmental gaze of his daughter-in-law, he felt the foundations of his quiet world begin to tremble. Chloe's world was the polar opposite of Arthur's. It was a meticulously curated stage upon which she performed the grand drama of her life. Her house, a sprawling new build in a gated community called the Estates at Willow Creek, was her primary set piece. It was a monument to conspicuous consumption, a house designed not for living in, but for being seen in. The furniture was all sharp angles and unforgiving fabrics, chosen from the pages of a glossy magazine. The walls were painted in various shades of grayish, a color Chloe believed screamed sophisticated, but which only served to make the vast spaces feel cold and unwelcoming. Art, in the form of massive, abstract canvases of clashing colors, was hung not for its emotional resonance, but for its ability to fill a wall. Every object had a price tag, and Chloe knew each one by heart. The Italian marble countertops, the German-engineered appliances, the custom-built wine cellar, these were not just things, they were trophies, evidence of her and David's ascent into the upper echelons of suburban society. She lived her life through the lens of social media, her every move documented and broadcast for the approval of her friends and followers. A trip to the farmer's market became a curated photo shoot of artisanal cheeses and organic produce. A family game night was a carefully staged tableau of wholesome fun, complete with matching pajamas and strategically placed board games. She spoke a language fluent in brand names and status symbols. Her conversations were littered with references to her Peloton instructor, her new Tesla, the waiting list for the new handbag, and the outrageous cost of the private school she planned to send Lily to next year. She was the architect of the family's social life, a relentless campaign of networking and social climbing disguised as friendship. Dinner parties were not for connection, but for conquest. She courted the wives of David's bosses, the influential members of the country club, and anyone she deemed to be a rung above them on the social ladder. David, Arthur's son, was a willing, if sometimes weary, co-conspirator in this grand project. He had inherited his father's work ethic, but not his quiet contentment. He was driven by a deep-seated fear of inadequacy, a fear Chloe had expertly tapped into and cultivated. He worked long, grueling hours at a private equity firm, his days a blur of spreadsheets and conference calls. He was good at his job, successful even, But the goalposts were always moving. The bigger house, the faster car, the more exotic vacation. There was always another level to achieve. He loved his father in his own way. He felt a pang of guilt every time Chloe made a snide remark about Arthur's simple lifestyle. He would try to defend him, but his defenses were always weak, half-hearted. "He's from a different generation, Chloe," he would say. "He's happy with what he has." But Chloe would pounce on the weakness. "Happy? David, he's not happy, he's stagnant. He's a reminder of where we came from, not where we're going. We're trying to build an empire, and he's sitting there in his rented apartment, mending his own socks. It's embarrassing." And David, exhausted from the pressures of his own life, would eventually concede. He allowed Chloe to manage the family's finances, to dictate their social calendar, and to set the tone for their interactions with his father. He told himself it was easier this way, that it was the price of peace in his own home. He had forgotten the man his father used to be. The memories had faded, replaced by Chloe's more convenient narrative. He remembered a father who worked hard, who ran a small machine shop, who was always a bit too busy. He didn't remember the fire in his father's eyes when he talked about a new design, the quiet confidence with which he commanded a room of engineers, or the day a fleet of black cars had pulled up to their modest house, filled with men in expensive suits who had come to make his father an offer that would change their lives forever. Arthur had shielded him from the details of that sale, wanting him to make his own way in the world without the corrupting influence of unearned wealth. It was a decision made from love, but it had inadvertently created the very chasm that now separated them. David saw his father's simplicity as proof of his past, modest success. He had no idea it was a choice, a rejection of a world that David was now desperately trying to conquer. The family's finances, which Chloe guarded like a hawk, were a source of constant stress, despite their high income. The mortgage on the house was crippling, the car payments were astronomical, and the cost of maintaining their lifestyle was a relentless beast that always needed feeding. Chloe's complaints about money were a constant refrain in the house. "If only we had a little more breathing room," she would sigh dramatically. "If only we didn't have so many obligations." Arthur had become one of those obligations. His monthly visits for dinner, his small, thoughtful gifts for Lily's birthday, a hand-carved bird, a collection of classic books, were seen not as gestures of love, but as pathetic reminders of his poverty. Chloe had once held up a beautiful, intricately carved wooden robin Arthur had made for Lily and said, "It's quaint," but Lily really wanted the new iPad. It was this complete and utter inability to see value in anything that couldn't be bought or sold that defined her. She was a product of her time, a hollow woman chasing a hollow dream. And Arthur, the quiet, unassuming man who represented everything she disdained, was about to become the catalyst for the implosion of her carefully constructed world. The family dinner was Chloe's stage, and tonight's performance was intended to be a masterpiece of subtle intimidation. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic and rosemary, a culinary smokescreen for the palpable tension. The meal was, as always, an exercise in excess. A glistening roasted chicken, far too large for the four of them, sat in the center of the table, surrounded by a constellation of side dishes in tiny, artful bowls. It was food designed to be photographed, not enjoyed. Chloe guided the conversation with the skill of a seasoned interrogator, her questions all leading toward the same destination, the validation of her own life choices. She talked at length about their upcoming trip to Tuscany, the trials of finding a reliable au pair, and the importance of a global mindset for a child's development. A pointed remark aimed at Lily, who had recently expressed a desire to volunteer at the local animal shelter, an idea Chloe had dismissed as unambitious. Arthur listened in silence, his presence a quiet rebuke to the superficiality of the conversation. He tried to engage with Lily, asking her about the book she was reading, but Chloe quickly rerouted the discussion back to herself. It was then that Arthur made his small, fateful mistake. Reaching for the water pitcher, his hand, stiff from a touch of arthritis, brushed against his wine glass. A few drops of dark red wine splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, a tiny, blooming stain on the canvas of Chloe's perfection. It was nothing, A minor spill. But in the hypercharged atmosphere of the room, it was a gunshot. Chloe's smile froze on her face. Her eyes narrowed, fixing on the small, dark red blemish as if it were a mortal wound. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Arthur," she snapped, her voice losing its polished veneer and revealing the sharp, ugly edges beneath. David immediately jumped in. "It's fine, Chloe. It's just a little spill. Don't worry about it." But Chloe was not listening. She saw the spill not as an accident, but as a metaphor for Arthur himself. He was a stain on her life, a messy, inconvenient intrusion into her perfect world. She dabbed at the spot with a napkin, her movements sharp and angry. "It's not fine, David. This is a new linen set. It was incredibly expensive." The rest of the meal passed in a thick, uncomfortable silence. Arthur ate little, the food turning to ash in his mouth. He felt the familiar weight of his son's shame and his granddaughter's sympathy. He wished, not for the first time, that he could simply disappear, that he could retreat back to the safety and anonymity of his small apartment. But he stayed. He stayed for Lily, who kept shooting him small, worried glances. He stayed because to leave would be to admit defeat, and he was not a man who retreated under fire. The final act began after the dessert plates were cleared. Chloe, emboldened by several glasses of wine and her own simmering resentment, decided it was time to bring her simmering monologue to its brutal climax. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, a predatory gleam in her eye. "You know, Arthur," she said, her voice a low, dangerous purr, "David and I have been doing a lot of thinking. About the future. About our financial goals." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, a silent plea in his eyes. "Chloe, maybe now isn't the time." "No, David, it is absolutely the time," she retorted, cutting him off. She turned her full attention back to Arthur, her painted smile a cruel slash across her face. "We work so hard, Arthur. Incredibly hard. We're trying to build something here, a legacy for Lily. And it requires sacrifice. It requires everyone to pull their own weight." The accusation was clear. Arthur was not pulling his weight. He was dead weight. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, his silence a vast, empty canvas onto which she could project all of her own insecurities and frustrations. Her voice rose, becoming shrill and accusatory. "I just don't understand why you don't even try. There are jobs for older people. A greeter at a store, a crossing guard. Something. Anything to show that you have some pride, some self-respect." The silence in the room was now so profound it felt like a physical presence, pressed in on them, sucking the air from their lungs. Lily's face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. David looked down at his hands, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Arthur's stoic facade finally cracked, but only for a moment. A flicker of deep, ancient pain crossed his features before being replaced by his customary mask of weary resignation. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to finally break his long-held vow of silence, but Chloe didn't give him the chance. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at him, her face contorted in a mask of righteous fury. "Honestly, Arthur," she shouted, her voice echoing in the cavernous dining room, "when are you going to get a job and stop being a leech? We can't carry you forever." The word hung in the air between them. Leech. It was a word of profound cruelty, a word designed to strip a man of his dignity, his history, his very humanity. In that moment, Arthur was no longer a father, a grandfather, a man who had loved and lost and built and dreamed. He was just a parasite, a burden, a leech. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the sound of a heart breaking, of a family bond shattering, of a line being crossed that could never be uncrossed. The echo of Chloe's shriek, the ugly, venomous word leech, seemed to cling to the very air in the room, staining the atmosphere like the wine on the tablecloth. David finally looked up, his face a mixture of horror and shame. "Chloe!" he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "My God, you can't say that." But Chloe was beyond reason now. She was caught in the grip of her own self-righteous fury, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a conviction that was terrifying in its intensity. "Why not David?" she shot back, whirling to face him. "Is it not true? Tell me, when was the last time he contributed anything? Anything at all? We pay for everything. We host these dinners. We buy the gifts. We are pouring our lives and our money into a future he is actively draining. It's the truth, and it's time someone finally said it." She was speaking to David, but her eyes were locked on Arthur, challenging him, daring him to deny her accusations. Arthur, however, remained impassive. He slowly placed his napkin on the table beside his plate, the simple, deliberate movement a stark contrast to Chloe's frantic energy. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. The storm of her anger broke against the seawall of his silence, and it infuriated her all the more. His lack of a reaction was, to her, the ultimate confirmation of his guilt. A man with pride would have argued, would have defended himself. A man with nothing, however, would have nothing to say. "See?" she spat, gesturing wildly at Arthur. "He doesn't even deny it. He just sits there, taking it because he knows it's true. He knows he's a burden to us." It was at this moment that Lily, the youngest and quietest person at the table, found her voice. "Stop it, Mom," she said, her own voice trembling but clear. "Just stop." Chloe turned on her daughter, her fury now seeking a new target. "You stay out of this, Lily. You're a child. You don't understand the pressures of the real world. You don't understand what it takes to build a life like this." "I understand that you're being cruel," Lily replied, her gaze unwavering. "Grandpa is a good person. He loves us. That's not being a leech. That's being family." Chloe let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Family? Oh, Lily, you are so naive. Family helps each other. It's a two-way street. Your grandfather's street seems to be permanently closed for construction." Arthur finally spoke. His voice was not loud, not angry, not even hurt. It was quiet, gravelly, and filled with an immense, bottomless weariness. "I see," he said, just 2 words. But in them Chloe heard a confession. Lily heard a surrender. David heard a verdict on his own failure as a son. Arthur slowly pushed his chair back from the table. The movement was slow, deliberate, the sound of the wooden legs on the floor a funereal dirge. He stood up, his posture straight, his dignity a fragile but intact shield around him. He looked at his son, not with anger, but with a profound and heartbreaking disappointment. It was a look that said, "I expected better of you. I taught you better than this." David flinched as if struck, unable to meet his father's gaze. Arthur's eyes then moved to Lily. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of her courage, a thank you for her defense. Finally, his gaze settled on Chloe. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time that evening, she saw something in his eyes beyond quiet resignation. She saw a flicker of the man he used to be, a flash of steel, of power, of a quiet authority that momentarily stunned her into silence. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a look of simple, final finality. "Thank you for the dinner," he said, his voice a flat, emotionless monotone. He turned without another word and began to walk toward the foyer, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence of the house. The spell was broken. The drama had reached its apparent conclusion. Chloe stood, flushed and triumphant, convinced she had won, that she had finally excised the problem from their lives. David remained frozen in his chair, a hollow sickness churning in his stomach. He had let this happen. He had stood by and watched his wife verbally crucify his own father. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. Only Lily seemed to understand that this was not an ending, but a beginning. She watched her grandfather walk away, a small, solitary figure retreating from a battle he had refused to fight, and she felt a fierce, protective love for him swell in her chest. She knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that her mother had just made a terrible, terrible mistake. The consequences of that mistake were already in motion, hurtling toward them like an unstoppable train, and they were all standing on the tracks, oblivious to the light in the distance. Lily couldn't bear it. She couldn't let him leave like this, vanquished and humiliated. She threw her napkin on the table and ran after him, her footsteps a frantic counterpoint to his slow, measured pace. "Grandpa, wait!" she called out, catching up to him in the grand, two-story foyer that Chloe was so proud of. The space was designed to impress visitors, with its sweeping staircase and oversized chandelier. But right now it just felt cold and empty, a marble and plaster tomb. Arthur stopped, his hand on the ornate handle of the front door. He turned to face her, and in the dim light, she could see the deep lines of pain etched around his eyes. He tried to smile for her, but it was a sad, tired gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "It's all right, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft. "It's late. I should be getting home." "No, it's not all right," she insisted, her own eyes filling with tears. "What Mom said, it was horrible. It's not true. None of it." He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His hand was rough and calloused, the hand of a man who had worked, but it was incredibly gentle. "Your mother is under a lot of pressure," he said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. He was still protecting them, still making excuses for them, even after the cruelty they had shown him. It was in this moment of quiet intimacy that the small, significant event occurred. As Arthur went to retrieve his simple, worn coat from the hall closet, his old leather wallet slipped from his inside pocket and fell to the marble floor. It didn't make much sound, but its contents spilled out in a small, scattered arc. A few dollar bills, a library card, a faded photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes, his late wife, Eleanor, and something else. Something that didn't belong. It was a coin. It wasn't a quarter or a nickel. It was heavy, thick, and made of a dull, bronze-colored metal. It rolled in a lazy circle before coming to a stop near the toe of Lily's shoe. She bent down and picked it up. It was surprisingly heavy in her palm, and warm, as if it held some residual heat. On one side, there was a complex, stylized logo she didn't recognize. A gear intertwined with a lightning bolt, with the words "Sterling Automations" curved around the top. On the other side was an inscription, finely engraved, "To A.V., the man who saw the future, from the grateful few." Lily looked from the strange, heavy coin to her grandfather's face. "What's this, Grandpa?" she asked, her curiosity overriding her sadness for a moment. Arthur looked at the coin in her hand, and a shadow passed over his features. It was a look of deep, profound memory, a glimpse into a past he kept locked away. He quickly took the coin from her, his movements almost furtive, and slipped it back into his wallet along with the other items. "It's nothing," he said, his voice a little too quick, a little too dismissive. "Just an old keepsake, from a job I had a long, long time ago." He put his coat on, the familiar, slightly musty smell of wool and old paper a comforting scent to Lily. He straightened the collar, his movements slow and methodical. He was putting his armor back on, retreating back into the shell of the quiet, unassuming old man. But Lily had seen a crack in that shell. She had seen the coin. She had seen the flicker of memory in his eyes. Her mother's words echoed in her head. A greeter at a store, a crossing guard, the man who received a heavy, custom-made coin that said, "The man who saw the future was not a man who had worked as a greeter." The pieces didn't fit. A seed of doubt, a tiny kernel of mystery, was planted in her mind. She had always known her grandfather was special, not because of what he had, but because of who he was. His quiet strength, his endless patience, his deep, unwavering kindness. These were qualities she admired more than her parents' frantic pursuit of wealth and status. Now she had a clue, a tangible piece of evidence that there was more to his story than anyone knew. He was a puzzle, a man of secrets and shadows, and she suddenly felt a fierce desire to solve it, to uncover the truth and use it as a shield to protect him. "I love you, Grandpa," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He pulled her into a gentle hug. "I love you too, my little lily pad," he whispered, using the old pet name he'd given her when she was a child. He held her for a moment longer, then released her, gave her one last sad smile and turned to the door. He didn't look back at the family he was leaving behind. He didn't see Chloe watching from the dining room doorway, her arms crossed, a smug, satisfied look on her face. He didn't see David, still sitting at the table, his head in his hands. He just opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, a solitary figure walking away from the life he had built, and the family that no longer seemed to want him in it. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, the sound as final as a gavel strike. Just as the sound of the front door clicking shut echoed through the silent house, a new sound pierced the quiet. The clear, insistent chime of the doorbell. It was sharp, authoritative, and completely unexpected at this hour. Chloe, who had been savoring her victory, frowned in annoyance. "Who on earth could that be?" she muttered, smoothing down her silk blouse and automatically checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. "Are we expecting someone else, David?" David shook his head from his position at the dining table, not even looking up. "No," he mumbled, his voice muffled by his hands. Lily, still standing in the foyer, felt a strange sense of premonition, a prickling on the back of her neck. The timing was too perfect, too theatrical. She looked through the tall, narrow sidelight window next to the door. Parked at the curb directly in front of their house was a car that did not belong in their neighborhood of SUVs and family sedans. It was a sleek, black sedan, the kind that whispered of money and power. It gleamed under the streetlight, its paint so deep it looked like a pool of liquid night. A man was walking up their front path, and he moved with a purpose that was both unnerving and impressive. "I'll get it," Chloe snapped, annoyed at everyone's inaction. She strode to the door, her irritation momentarily eclipsing the drama of the last hour. She flung the door open, her face set in a mask of impatient inquiry, ready to dismiss whoever was on her doorstep. The man standing there stopped her cold. He was in his late 60s, perhaps, with a full head of silver hair, cut with military precision. He wore a dark, exquisitely tailored suit that probably cost more than their monthly mortgage payment. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He held a slim, elegant leather briefcase in one hand. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. They were a pale, piercing blue, and they radiated an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. This was a man who was not used to being kept waiting, a man who commanded boardrooms and silenced arguments with a single, level gaze. Chloe's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. Her irritation vanished, replaced by a sycophantic, ingratiating smile. She immediately recognized the scent of power, the aura of wealth. This must be a new neighbor, a CEO, a potential client for David. Connection. "Well, hello there," she cooed, her voice suddenly sweet and welcoming. "Can I help you?" The man's piercing blue eyes swept over her, a quick, dismissive appraisal that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, completely insignificant. His gaze then moved past her, scanning the foyer. "I'm looking for Arthur Vance," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, a voice that carried weight and expected to be obeyed. "I was told I could find him here." Chloe's smile faltered for a second. Arthur? Why would this powerful, important man be looking for her pathetic old father-in-law? She quickly recovered, seeing an opportunity. Arthur? Of course. He was just here for a family dinner. "I'm Chloe, his daughter-in-law." She extended a hand, which the man ignored completely. "And this is our home. Please, come in." She stepped aside, gesturing him into the foyer as if she were welcoming royalty. "My husband, David, Arthur's son, is right here. Perhaps we can help you with whatever you need." She was already calculating the angles, imagining the story she would tell her friends. "A mysterious, wealthy associate of my father-in-law showed up at our house last night. He was clearly very important." The man stepped inside, his expensive leather shoes making almost no sound on the marble floor. He gave David a curt nod, his expression unreadable, before his eyes settled on Lily. He gave her a small, almost kind smile, and then his gaze returned to the front door, which was still slightly ajar. "I'm sorry, I seem to have just missed him," he said, his tone professional but with an undercurrent of urgency. "My name is James Harrison. I am Mr. Vance's attorney and financial advisor." The words hung in the air. Attorney. Financial advisor. Chloe's mind raced. Arthur didn't have a financial advisor. He had a small pension, maybe some social security. He probably needed a lawyer for some minor issue, a will perhaps. She decided to press her advantage. "Well, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice oozing charm. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Anything you need to discuss with Arthur, I'm sure we can handle. We manage all of his affairs. He's not really in a position to handle complex matters anymore, if you understand my meaning." Harrison's cold, blue eyes fixed on her. The temperature in the foyer seemed to drop several degrees. A long, uncomfortable silence stretched out, during which he simply looked at her, his expression one of utter contempt. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with ice. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I can assure you, with a certainty that borders on the absolute, that you do not, in fact, manage Mr. Vance's affairs." He then looked past her, his eyes locking onto something outside. Arthur. He hadn't gotten far. He was walking slowly down the sidewalk, a solitary figure under the orange glow of the streetlights. "Arthur," Harrison called out, his powerful voice cutting through the night. "Arthur, wait. I'm glad I caught you. We need to discuss the quarterly disbursement from the primary trust. There's a matter of a significant capital gain that requires your signature." The words, primary trust, quarterly disbursement, and significant capital gain, landed in the foyer like a series of explosions, each one sending shockwaves through Chloe's carefully constructed reality. Her smiling, sycophantic mask shattered, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated confusion. Trust? Capital gain? This didn't make any sense. Couldn't be her Arthur he was talking about. It had to be a mistake. Arthur turned at the sound of his name. Seeing James Harrison standing on his son's brightly lit porch was like seeing a character from one life step into the stage of another. He felt a sense of weary resignation. His quiet world, the one he had so carefully constructed and fiercely protected for over 2 decades, was about to be breached. He walked slowly back up the path, his face a stoic mask, and nodded at his old friend. "James," he said, his voice quiet, "what are you doing here? I thought we were meeting next week." Harrison clapped a hand on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture of deep respect and long-standing camaraderie. "Something came up with the tech portfolio," he said, his voice now lower, more personal. "It needs your eye. You know I don't trust anyone else with it." Chloe stood in the doorway, her mind reeling, trying to process the scene unfolding before her. The deference with which this powerful man treated her father-in-law was utterly baffling. It was the way one treated a superior, a mentor, a king. "I'm sorry," she interrupted, unable to contain her confusion. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. My father-in-law, he doesn't have a tech portfolio." James Harrison turned his head slowly, fixing her with a stare that could freeze fire. He had heard her final, shouted insult as he'd gotten out of his car. He had seen the pain in Arthur's eyes. And James Harrison was a man fiercely loyal to the few people he respected. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "are Chloe correct?" Chloe nodded, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Harrison took a small step forward, his presence filling the doorway. He was no longer just an attorney. He was an executioner, preparing to deliver a final, fatal judgment. He spoke directly to her, but his voice was loud and clear, intended for everyone in the house to hear. It was a monologue he had been waiting years to deliver. "For 22 years, he began, his voice a perfectly controlled instrument of devastating clarity. "I have had the distinct honor of representing Arthur Vance. I have watched him, in silence, as he has allowed you and your husband to believe a fiction he created out of love, to protect his son from the corrosive influence of a fortune he never had to earn. Chloe's mouth fell open. David, drawn by the commotion, was now standing in the foyer, his face ashen. Harrison continued, his words precise and unsparing. "You see this man," he said, gesturing to Arthur. "And you see a simple, retired machinist. A relic, a burden, what you call a leech." He let the ugly word hang in the air for a moment, twisting the knife he had just inserted. "Let me tell you who you are looking at." His voice rose, taking on the tone of a prosecutor delivering his closing argument. "You are looking at the founder, sole creator, and visionary genius behind Sterling Automations, a company he started in his garage with $300 and an idea everyone, and I mean everyone, told him was impossible. He didn't just build a company, he built an industry. He revolutionized robotic logistics and sold patents that are still used in nearly every major warehouse and distribution center on the planet." On-screen text would flash. Sterling Automations, founded 1982. 127 active patents. Harrison paused, letting the information sink in. "In 1999, when your husband was still in college, Arthur sold that company. He sold it not because it was failing, but because it was at its absolute zenith. He sold it to a multinational corporation for a sum that was, at the time, staggering." Chloe was shaking her head, a desperate, silent denial. This was impossible. A fantasy. "He walked away from that sale," Harrison continued, his gaze relentless, "with a net personal profit of $22 million. On-screen text, sale price, $22 million. He took that money and gave me two instructions. First, set up an irrevocable trust for his son, David, and a second one for his future grandchildren. Trusts that neither of you know about, designed to mature and provide for you in your later years. Second, he instructed me to invest the rest, his personal fortune, with the goal of quiet, steady growth. He wanted to live on the interest and only the interest and to never touch the principal. He wanted to live simply. He was tired of the noise. He was tired of the sycophants and the grasping hands." Harrison took a step closer to Chloe, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "That principal, the one he has never touched? As of the market's close this afternoon, the Arthur Vance Primary Trust is valued at $5,342,118.74. On-screen text, Arthur Vance Personal Trust, $5,342,118.74. Chloe felt the floor drop out from under her. Her legs went weak, and she had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. $5 million. The number was incomprehensible, but Harrison wasn't finished. He had one final, devastating blow to deliver. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single folder. "You spoke of him being a leech," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You complained about having to carry him. It might interest you to know, Mrs. Vance, that for the past 3 years, since you bought this ridiculously oversized house with its crippling mortgage, Arthur has been making anonymous payments to your lender through a blind account I manage for him. He was worried you were overextended. He was worried about David being under too much pressure." He opened the folder. "He has, to date, paid $278,000 of your mortgage for you. He did this quietly, without any expectation of thanks, because he is your father, and he loves his family. Even when they show him nothing but scorn and disrespect." He held up a bank statement for her to see. The numbers were there in black and white, an undeniable testament to the truth. "So you see, Chloe," Harrison concluded, his voice now soft, almost pitying, "he hasn't been a leech on you. For the last 3 years, you, your husband, and your entire carefully curated lifestyle have been a leech on him." The silence that descended upon the foyer was absolute. It was heavier than grief, more profound than any sound. It was the silence of a world completely and irrevocably shattered. Chloe stood frozen in the doorway, her face a ghastly shade of white. Her perfectly made-up face seemed to crack and crumble, becomes uplifting, a call to community. If this story moved you, if it made you think, If it reminded you of the quiet heroes in your own life, please consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear this message. For more powerful stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul, make sure you click that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Our community is built on stories like this, stories that remind us of the best parts of our humanity. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We will see you in the next one. The final shot is of Arthur's window from the outside, a single square of warm, yellow light in the vast, dark expanse of the sleeping city, a beacon of quiet, unassuming strength.